Good morning friends, Namaskar, Sat Sri Akal and Adab. This is my 233rd video and this will be covering for the first time a new chapter altogether. These will be covering videos on Cantonment Code, House Accommodation Act, Cantonment Land Administration Rules and RAIP Act 1952. So what is this first video today? This first video goes with the pinnacle of the happening in these cantonments. I came across a letter of 1982 dated 22nd October, letter number 201/228 ACQ, Director Lands and Sections 361-7. Now, what does this letter say? This letter is very important for people to understand. It's a very small understanding, but it is a very vital understanding. Here, the government, after this letter, Ministry of Defence, actually stopped payment for all the compensation, rent, pension paid to the villagers of various cantonments of whose land was requisitioned. Friends, I am not going to use the word acquired because the land was actually requisitioned. So how was this land requisitioned? On a presumption, let's say Barrackpur, we say, well, Danapur was the first cantonment, but Barrackpur. So lands during that period were never acquired. So the acquisition system was that land was given in lieu of land. Let's say the Britishers or the British government or the British Army wanted a piece of land, they would give you that equivalent land in a particular distance as per your desires or their availabilities, and that's how you cluster the land. So the requirement for Britishers of land was for what? For making of these military stations. Remember, these were not cantonments. Till 1833, I don't believe any of these cantonments were cantonments. They were military stations. Now, what did the British officer or the DC then did? The Indian methodology of law or interpretations of the Wazibul-Arz was that every community village had a Wazibul-Arz. So, Wazibul-Arz basically is the local law to be adhered by the villagers in the community living up there. So if anybody is laid hands like in Agra, like in Ambala, I have my Wazibul-Arz. I remember Mr. Jain sharing me a Wazibul-Arz of Agra either. So the simple doing what the Britishers did, one needs to understand, they requisitioned these lands under this Wazibul-Arz. So they, for Teh-Umar, this is the Urdu word used in Ambala Lazibur. So this was requisitioned for life. My land, whose I was the proprietor, under what orders? Under the Badshahi Grant or the non-Badshahi grants. So my land was requisitioned and it was taken for the British, whether army or British working, I don't know. Let's put it this way. So my original grants were taken. Now why were they taken? See, the Britishers were actually making laws and they were very clear. You know, if they had to slap an officer or an Indian native, they made a law for it, how he has to be slapped. They didn't break the law. So they made a law and the law was very easy. The Governor General order used to pass a statutory finding that this is how this will happen. And then that was implemented by the district collector. Who was the district collector? Again a British officer, either a lieutenant, a colonel, major or anybody. So basically we were being ruled during that period by a chunk of about 8,000 to 7,000 officers of the British Army. This report of number of officers is in the Imperial Gazetteer 1887. So one needs to understand. So the thumb rule which the Britishers, after taking the Diwani from the rulers of the Indian government, they actually saw that these grants were revenue free grants. There was no lagan or anything coming to the coffers except for the produce. That was 1/3 of the produce. The original Akbari system. In between we had other systems also which flew after Akbari. We had the Jahangir system, we had the Aurangzeb land system. So basically the thumb rule was more of the Akbari system made by Raja Todamwal. So the thumb rule was what the Britishers created in 1795-93, I would use, is that 1 BIGA, 1 rupee is the lagan you will pay for the grant which you hold, either in the format of Badshahi or non-Badshahi. So this grant of 1 rupee had to be paid to the British coffers by the grantee or the proprietor. So grant does not mean that you cannot be a proprietor. One needs to understand. Unfortunately, we understand that grant is something which is given to the X through the government. No. In 1793 or 1763, grant meant something else. Grant holders were proprietors because they were revenue free grants. So this is how these villages came up. Now through the Wazibul-Arz, land moved to the British. Let's say now the British officer or the British army had to create a military station. I will put an example of my cantonment, Ambala. So some 17 village, Wazibul-Arz is with me. I have it. I have the original 1843 boundary pillar plan also of 1 to 36 pillars, which actually culminated in 1877. So I have that ghatta also. I have every separate ghatta of every 17 village. So 9,200 acre land was taken for Ambala. And if people in Ambala are listening and villagers of various 17 villages or at any cantonment, whether it be Meerut, Jabalpur, Sagar, Jalandhar, 9,200 rupees were being paid since 1843 to these villagers in Pedigree as proprietors in lieu as what? Rent, compensation, reimbursement of land revenue, or what? That has to be understood. So now, why did the Indian government in 1982 stop this payment? So the letter speaks, the treasury rules for withdrawal of funds for the making of payment of compensation for requisition properties for defense services. It has been decided in consultation with the Ministry of Defense, Department of Finance and Computer Auditor General of India. The money paid by states through the district collector or local district commissioners on such accounts will be obtained only from the local MODO or the Ministry of Defense. So why in 82 this was stopped, and this was made effective from 1st January 1983. So all payments the DC had to stop. Now this letter is very smartly speaking of after 1983. It says all requisitions after this date. This is what this letter speaks. Now I'll read you this letter. How cunningly the Ministry of Defense plays with the sentiments of these landowners who were the original grants through the non-Badshahi and the Badshahi grant. And even the Indian government after independence is usurping our compensation. So now what does the DC do? He doesn't think of post or pre 1947 or this letter 1982. He just thumbly stops all the payments. Now there is an annexure attached to this letter and it has some subsidiary section. The DC will not withdraw any payment without the knowledge of the MU. Agreed. DC will inform the demand 1 month prior to the MU. Absolutely agreed. All withdrawals made will be accompanied with a full report of land award. So this could be for 1947 and post or 1982 and after. But what prior? Now please understand, simple cash account has to be rendered to the MU and by 10th of every month. Now friends, just look at what is written in the last. We people don't read these letters. Very smartly this condition says that even this will be applicable to all requisitioned lands prior to 1st January 1983. So from 1795 when Barakpur Cantonment was made. So friends, please understand how Ministry of Defence, Government of India in these executive orders have stopped paying land revenue to the villagers of these cantonments, and in specific to my cantonment Ambala, where I have the record also that why the DC, I have that DC letter also, and I even have the first district commissioner of Ambala post 1947 letter that this compensation being paid for non-acquisition of lands of the villagers in Ambala. So now the villagers generally don't understand what is this amount coming. So in Ambala they claim it to be pension, whether it is rent, whether it is land revenue, vice versa being reimbursed. So nothing is known by these villagers and they simply file court cases by claiming themselves as owners. They forget reading their Wazibul-Arz. Now why I would go back to this 1982 letter from 1801. 1982 and 1801, what is the difference between these two letters? It says 1801 when British officer will be given some land to build his house in a military station, he is not entitled to purchase, buy or put in possession any land which is being referred here as gardens. Now if he has taken over any garden or old grant, he will reimburse it back to the British Army and that garden would be resumed from the original proprietor under this Governor General order. So here friends, understand, resumption did not mean that you are not the proprietor of the grant. So resumption even for a grant had to be taken place. So these meanings have to be understood. And if we don't educate ourselves, I have nothing much to say. People, I sometimes feel very disgusted. I simply would say if you cannot define these two words, resumption and grant or suffixly old grant, you are beggars. You are those rich, well-off beggars living in these cantonments. Honestly speaking, none of us know the laws what the Britishers wrote for us. And by reading, watching my videos, some people have grown as consultants now and I feel astonished, ashamed. So now came I'll talk from 1763, 1793, 1801. Let's go to 11th June 1833. So there is now a circular passed by the military board officers which says if there is surplus land in any military station requisitioned through the Wazibul-Arz, this surplus land will be handed over back to the revenue authority, or meaning by the board of revenue officers, the DC of that district. Friends, if land was acquired in 1793 or 1801 or 1833, what was the need of giving it back as surplus land then? So land was actually not acquired. So we need to understand, because there was no law during that period for acquisition of lands. Well, we were slaves. We were being thumbed by the British army. So that I understand, that they walked into our land and they just said this is ours. So we as natives or poor Indians and slaves could not render to their might and power. So we must have given up our lands, but the Britishers were very honest. Now let's say they took our land through force or through war, what the most of the Indian councils after 1947 plead in their court cases of resumption, which I read, that a cantonment was made after a war, and when the ex-Raja lost, the land escheated to the British. No, it doesn't happen like this. The Charter Act actually stopped them in 1763. That the Queen and England had very clearly said that no land will be acquired or taken by the British Army through war. So stop living in these fancy worlds. So meaning hereby that when notification for boundary pillars was done, because 1833 surplus land was being handed over, so must have been that the civil authority, now it was the DC's duty, because DCs were created. Now let's say Ambala DC, but I have a record, Ambala DC was first created in 1844. So we need to understand, he must have created the boundary pillars, he must have made a report of whose land was settlements already taken up in 1820 or 1833 of my cantonment or your cantonment. So what I came across, that first the Land Acquisition Act which has been referred is 1850 or 1870, and then came the 1895 Land Acquisition Act. So when were these cantonments notified is to be very important. None of the cantonments, the first cantonment notified was Nasirabad in 1861, and subsequently 1870, in 1877 Ambala was notified. So when these notifications were taking place, that means the DC must have made a full report. Now sometimes we call it vernacular record. So friends, please understand, when these military cantonments were being created prior to 1833, no acquisition was done. It was only requisition of properties from 1795 to 1806 by the Deputy Quartermaster General, and he was supposed to make boundaries for all this. So friends, we just need to understand, land was never acquired, it was only requisitioned, and the various Governor General orders speaks of it. I just came across a report of 1843 of my cantonment. I just read a report of Meerut. It has been written by the local MLA there. Similarly, Jabalpur, villagers approached me. We have Sagar cantonment judgment of the villagers. So friends, please admit it. Please understand why these acts were in place: House Accommodation Act, CLA rules, cantonment codes, RAIP Act. They all culminate into the making of these military stations, and then further after the 1864 we were called cantonments, and we had separate boundary pillars for us. Once again, I am saying we are old grants, never converted into new grants, because we were revenue free grants. Thank you. Good day.